In 2022, a study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine followed 1,702 adults aged 51 to 75 for 7 years. The test was simple. Stand on one leg for 10 seconds without support. Adults who could not do it had an 84% higher risk of dying from any cause within the next decade, not falling, not fracturing a hip, dying, from cardiovascular disease, from cancer, from everything. A 10-second balance test predicted all-cause mortality more accurately than many standard clinical assessments. Question nobody asked after the study was published is why. What is balance measuring that a blood test cannot? There is a sensor in each inner ear, roughly the size of a pea, that detects angular displacements of less than 0.003 of a degree, finer than a telescope tracking a star. There are hair cells inside that sensor that die throughout life and are never replaced, and after 40, the loss accelerates. And there is a reason the test predicts death from cancer and heart disease, not just death from falling, because vascular and neural processes that cause those diseases also degrade the 4 systems that produce balance. All of it comes later. Start with what the test is actually measuring, because balance is not what most people think it is. Standing on one leg is not a test of leg strength. It is an integration test, a real-time assessment of how well 4 independent sensory and motor systems communicate with each other and with the cerebellum. 4 systems running simultaneously below conscious awareness, producing a single output, staying upright, vestibular system in the inner ear, detecting head position and angular acceleration through the physics of fluid dynamics, visual system, providing spatial orientation relative to the external world, proprioceptive system, mechanoreceptors in muscles, tendons, and joints, reporting limb position and force continuously, and the motor cortex and cerebellum, integrating all 3 sensory inputs and generating the corrective muscle commands required to maintain an upright position on a single point of support. When you stand on one leg, your body sways. Not by much, typically 1 to 3 degrees of angular displacement, but continuously. Every sway requires a correction. Each correction requires that the vestibular system detect the angular change. The proprioceptors report the shift in muscle tension. The visual system confirms spatial position. The cerebellum integrate these 3 signals, compute the required correction vector, and send a motor command to the foot, ankle, and hip muscles, all within approximately 100 to 200 milliseconds. Standing on one leg is not stillness. It is continuous, high-speed, multi-system feedback control operating below conscious awareness. The 10-second test is measuring the bandwidth of this control loop. Think about what that means. The person who cannot hold one leg stance for 10 seconds is not failing a balance test. They are failing an integration test, revealing that the communication speed between 4 separate systems has degraded to the point where the correction loop cannot keep pace with the sway. The wobble that ends the test is the moment the loop falls behind. Now, the study itself. Because the numbers are harder to dismiss than most clinical findings, Claudio Gil Araujo and colleagues at the Exercise Medicine Clinic, C-LINEMX, in Rio de Janeiro, published the findings in June 2022. Each participant attempted to stand on one leg for 10 seconds, either leg, eyes open, arms at their sides. 20.4% failed. Over the follow-up period, 17.5% of those who failed died, compared to 4.6% of those who passed. After adjusting for age, sex, BMI, and existing medical conditions, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia, the inability to stand on one leg for 10 seconds was associated with an 84% increased risk of all-cause mortality. The hazard ratio was 1.84. Test outperformed BMI as a mortality predictor. It outperformed waist circumference. The predictive power held across every subgroup, every age bracket, both sexes, every body type. Age stratification within the data is worth pausing on. Among subjects aged 51 to 55, approximately 5% failed the 10-second test. Among subjects aged 71 to 75, approximately 54% failed. The decline is not linear. It accelerates after 65, matching the acceleration in vestibular hair cell loss, peripheral nerve conduction decline, and Purkinje cell depletion that the physiology predicts. The test is tracking biological aging, not calendar aging. And the biological aging of the balance system accelerates in precisely the decades when the mortality data becomes most predictive. No equipment, no blood draw, no imaging, no physician. 10 seconds on one foot predicted death from all causes with a statistical power that most expensive clinical diagnostics cannot match. The reason is that the test is not measuring one thing. It is measuring everything through a single observable output. Well, and the physics of the first system. The test measures is extraordinary. Because the vestibular organ is one of the most precise measuring instruments in all of biology, each inner ear contains a vestibular system roughly the size of a pea. It consists of 3 semicircular canals, oriented in 3 mutually perpendicular planes, and 2 otolith organs, the utricle and saccule. Semicircular canals detect angular acceleration through the physics of fluid inertia. Each canal is a fluid-filled tube. When the head rotates, the canal rotates with it, but the fluid inside, fortiseth, endolymph, lags behind due to inertia. The relative motion of the fluid against the canal wall deflects a gelatinous structure called the cupula, which bends hair cells embedded in the crista ampullaris. The bending generates an electrical signal proportional to the angular velocity of the head. 3 canals in 3 planes detect rotation in any axis. The physics is identical to the operation of a gyroscope. Angular momentum of the fluid resists the change in orientation, and the resistance is measured as displacement. Otolith organs detect linear acceleration and head tilt relative to gravity. Each contains a layer of calcium carbonate. Crystals, otoconia, embedded in a gelatinous matrix sitting on top of hair cells. When the head tilts, gravity pulls the otoconia downward, deflecting the hair cells and generating a signal that encodes head angle relative to the gravitational vector. The physics is a mass on a spring system. The crystals provide the inertial mass, the gelatinous matrix provides the restoring force, and the hair cells transduce the displacement into neural signal. Your head's relationship with gravity is measured by a set of microscopic calcium crystals deflecting under gravitational force. The instrument that detects whether you are tilting is a geological sensor, using mineral crystals and Newtonian gravity, running in biological tissue. Otoconia can become dislodged, shaken free from the gelatinous matrix by head trauma, infection, or age-related degeneration of the matrix proteins. When a loose otoconium enters one of the semicircular canals, it deflects the cupula inappropriately, generating a false signal of head rotation. The result is benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, BPPV, the most common vestibular disorder in older adults. The room spins because a calcium crystal the size of a grain of sand has migrated from the otolith organ into a semicircular canal and is producing a rotational signal from a gravitational source. The physics is precise. The crystal's density exceeds the endolymph density, so it settles under gravity toward the lowest point in the canal, dragging fluid with it, deflecting the cupula, and generating the sensation of spinning. A repositioning maneuver. The Epley maneuver uses gravity to move the crystal back out of the canal. The treatment for a vertigo attack is Newtonian mechanics applied to a migrated mineral crystal inside the inner ear. The hair cells in the vestibular system detect angular displacements of less than 0.003 of a degree, roughly 1/1000th of the angular width of the moon as seen from Earth. Balance system is measuring head rotation at an angular resolution finer than a telescope tracking a star. This measurement runs continuously, updating at approximately 100 Hz without conscious input from the moment you wake until the moment you fall asleep. Instrument is extraordinary. What follows is what happens to it over a lifetime. Hair cells of the vestibular system are produced during embryonic development and never again. Unlike the hair cells of some reptiles and birds, which regenerate throughout life, Mammalian vestibular hair cells are a fixed population. The human vestibular system begins with approximately 33,000 hair cells in each inner ear, roughly 15,000 in the semicircular canal cristae, and 18,000 in the otolith maculae. After approximately age 40, these cells begin dying at a rate of roughly 3% per decade. By 70, the average person has lost 15 to 40% of their vestibular hair cells, depending on exposure to ototoxic medications, noise damage, and individual variation. Each lost cell reduces the signal-to-noise ratio of the vestibular system. The remaining cells must provide spatial information with fewer sensors. The neural signal becomes noisier. The integration in the cerebellum must work harder to extract the same quality of spatial data from a degraded input. Rauch and colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital published post-mortem histological studies documenting the progressive loss of type 1 hair cells, the fast-adapting cells that detect rapid head movements, at a rate that accelerated after 60. Merchant confirmed that Scarpa's ganglion neurons, the neurons connecting vestibular hair cells to the brainstem, declined by approximately 3% per decade as well, compounding the sensor loss with a wiring loss. Balance system is losing both its sensors and its cabling simultaneously. The measurement that was running at 33,000 sensors at birth is running on 20,000 by 70, and the neurons carrying the signal have thinned in parallel. That finding, irreversible sensor loss in the organ that measures your relationship with gravity, compounding decade over decade, with no regeneration mechanism in mammals, is the one that made the mortality data land differently for me. Because it means the 10-second test is not measuring a skill that can atrophy and be rebuilt from scratch. It is measuring the cumulative state of a biological sensor array that is irreversibly degrading with every decade of life. The test reads the degradation. The degradation tracks the aging of every system connected to it. The irreversibility is specific to mammals. Birds regenerate vestibular hair cells throughout life. A songbird that loses hair cells to noise damage regrows them within weeks. Reptiles regenerate them. Fish regenerate them. Mammals do not. The evolutionary reason is debated. One hypothesis is that the mammalian cochlea and vestibular organs sacrificed regenerative capacity in exchange for the structural precision required for high-frequency hearing, which mammals develop for predator detection and social communication. Whatever the reason, the consequence is that every human alive is running on a fixed and declining sensor budget for the organ that detects orientation relative to gravity. Every person alive is on this trajectory. A one-way loss of vestibular hair cells. The cells are not replaced. The loss is cumulative. And the system they serve, the system that detects head position relative to gravity 100 times per second, is one of the 4 systems the 10-second test captures. Now, the second system. Because proprioception is the sense most people have never heard of, and its decline explains the specific feeling of uncertainty that arrives with age. Proprioception is the sense of body position and movement, mediated by mechanoreceptors distributed throughout the musculoskeletal system. Muscle spindles detect changes in muscle length and rate of change, where the limb is, and how fast it is moving. Golgi tendon organs at the muscle-tendon junction detect force, how hard the muscle is pulling. Joint receptors in the ligaments and capsules detect joint angle and rate of angular change. Pacinian corpuscles in the skin of the feet detect pressure distribution and vibration, providing the somatosensory cortex with a continuous map of the foot's contact with the ground. When you stand on one leg, the ankle joint becomes the primary balance platform. The foot contains 26 bones, 33 joints, and over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments. A biomechanical platform of extraordinary complexity that most people think of as the simple bottom of the leg. Mechanoreceptors in the ankle ligaments and foot sole provide the cerebellar integration system with a continuous readout of pressure distribution, ankle angle, and rate of sway. The corrective motor commands that prevent falling originate from this data. Ankle strategy. The primary balance correction mechanism on a stable surface works by modulating ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, tilting the entire body as a rigid, inverted pendulum around the ankle joint. The muscles producing this correction, the tibialis anterior and the gastrocnemius soleus complex, are the fastest responding anti-gravity muscles in the body, generating corrective torque within 150 milliseconds of a detected sway. When the sway exceeds what the ankle strategy can correct, roughly 2 degrees of angular displacement, the hip strategy activates, generating a counter-rotation at the hip to bring the center of mass back over the base of support. When both strategies fail, the stepping strategy activates. The body takes a step to widen the base of support. Each strategy is a progressively more disruptive correction for a progressively larger perturbation. The 10-second test captures the first two. The person who takes a step has already failed. Proprioceptive acuity declines with age through multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously. Muscle spindle density decreases. Joint receptor sensitivity decreases. Pacinian corpuscle density in the sole of the foot declines. The pressure mat becomes coarser and slower, and peripheral nerve conduction velocity decreases by approximately 0.4% per year after age 40. The signal from foot to cerebellum arrives later. Every millisecond of delay in the proprioceptive signal reduces the time available for the cerebellum to compute a correction before the sway exceeds the recoverable range. Footwear compounds the decline. A thick-soled shoe attenuates the pressure signal from the ground surface. The Pacinian corpuscles receive a filtered, dampened version of the ground contact that a bare or thin-soled foot would transmit at full resolution. The proprioceptive data arriving at the cerebellum is already degraded by age. The shoe degrades it further. Research on barefoot training in older adults shows measurable improvements in postural sway, not because the foot becomes stronger, but because the proprioceptive signal from the sole arrives with less attenuation, giving the cerebellum cleaner data to work with. The sensor has not improved. The filter between the sensor and the ground has been removed. You see, the specific feeling of uncertainty that arises when an older person steps onto an uneven surface, the moment of hesitation, the reaching for a railing, is the conscious experience of a proprioceptive system delivering slower, coarser data than it delivered at 30. The ground feels less certain because the sensory report from the foot is less certain. The proprioceptors have not failed. They have degraded in density, in sensitivity, in transmission speed. The hesitation is the brain acknowledging that its position data is less trustworthy than it was. Now, the integration engine that processes all of it. Because the cerebellum is doing something that engineering only invented in the 20th century, and it has been doing it for 500 million years. Cerebellum contains roughly half of all neurons in the brain, approximately 50 billion Purkinje cells and granule cells, despite occupying only 10% of total brain volume. Its primary function and balance is sensory-motor integration, receiving vestibular, proprioceptive, and visual inputs simultaneously, computing the body's current position and angular velocity in three-dimensional space, predicting where the body will be in the next fraction of a second based on current sway trajectory, and generating a corrective motor output to the anti-gravity muscles before the sway completes. This is predictive control. The cerebellum does not wait for the body to fall and then correct. It predicts the fall from current trajectory data and generates the correction in advance, using forward models that compute the sensory consequences of motor actions before those consequences arrive. Every correction you feel when standing on one leg, every micro-adjustment in the ankle, every subtle shift in hip position was computed by the cerebellum before the sway it corrects was consciously detectable. The conscious mind experiences the result. The cerebellum computed it 200 milliseconds earlier. The computational principle is identical to what drives Kalman filters in missile guidance, predictive algorithms in autonomous vehicles, and forward models in robotics. The cerebellum was doing predictive control engineering 500 million years before humans invented the concept. The mathematical formalism that describes what the cerebellum does, state estimation, forward prediction, error correction, was developed by engineers in the 1960s to solve guidance problems. The cerebellum solved them in the Cambrian, when the first vertebrates needed to maintain orientation in three-dimensional water. That is the finding that stopped me in the balance literature. Because it means the computation running, when you stand on one leg, is not a simple reflex. It is a predictive algorithm, 500 million years old, solving in real time a mathematical problem that human engineers needed differential equations and digital computers to formalize. And it is running below conscious awareness at a speed conscious thought cannot match in an organ that most people could not name. Cerebellar Purkinje cells decline with age, approximately 2.5% per decade after 60. The dendritic arbors of surviving cells simplify, losing branches, reducing the number of synaptic inputs each cell can integrate. Each Purkinje cell receives input from approximately 200,000 parallel fibers, one of the highest convergence ratios in the entire nervous system. When the dendritic tree simplifies, the number of inputs the cell can integrate drops. The predictions become less precise. The corrections arrive later. The sway amplitude increases. The 10-second test becomes harder, not because the muscles have weakened, but because the computer running the balance calculation has fewer processors and fewer connections between them. And here is why the 10-second test predicts death from cancer and heart disease, not just death from falling. Because this is where the four systems converge with the rest of the body's health. Vestibular system requires intact sensory neurons and adequate blood supply from the labyrinthine artery, a small vessel whose flow is compromised by atherosclerosis, identical to what causes coronary artery disease. Proprioceptive system requires intact peripheral nerves whose conduction velocity depends on adequate myelination, which degrades in diabetes, in vitamin B12 deficiency, in metabolic conditions that elevate cardiovascular risk. Cerebellum requires intact Purkinje cells and adequate perfusion, which declines with small vessel disease, with hypertension, with vascular pathology, identical to what predicts stroke. Motor output requires intact neuromuscular junctions, which degrade with systemic inflammation, the inflammatory state that underlies both cardiovascular disease and cancer progression. Every component of the balance system degrades with pathologies that kill people. A person with subclinical vascular disease has reduced perfusion to the vestibular organs and the cerebellum. Their balance worsens before their coronary arteries close, before the chest pain arrives, before any cardiac test would flag the problem. A person with early peripheral neuropathy from diabetes has degraded proprioceptive input. Their ankle sway increases before their blood sugar is diagnosed as dangerous, before the numbness in their feet becomes noticeable, before any neurological examination would identify the deficit. A person with chronic systemic inflammation has accelerated neuronal loss throughout the central nervous system. Their Purkinje cells thin before the inflammation produces a diagnosable disease, before any blood test would flag the inflammatory markers as clinically significant. Balance test catches subclinical disease because the balance system is more sensitive to early vascular, neural, and inflammatory changes than the symptoms those changes eventually produce. The vestibular organ's blood supply through the labyrinthine artery is so small and so sensitive to flow reduction that even modest atherosclerosis, the kind that produces no chest pain, no shortness of breath, no clinical symptoms, can reduce vestibular perfusion enough to degrade the signal. The 10-second test reads the degraded signal. The cardiologist reads the normal ECG. The balance test is detecting the disease the standard assessment has not yet found. 10-second test captures all of these simultaneously. It is not measuring balance. It is measuring the integrated functional state of the cardiovascular, nervous, and musculoskeletal systems through their shared output. The ability to maintain postural control on a reduced base of support. A blood test measures one biomarker at a time. An imaging study examines one organ at a time. The balance test examines the functional integration of every system that keeps a person alive and upright in one 10-second window through one observable output. Think about that. The reason a 10-second balance test predicts death from cancer and heart disease is that the vascular, neural, and inflammatory processes that cause those diseases also degrade the four systems that produce balance. The test is not measuring balance as a skill. It is using balance as a window into the body's overall systemic integrity. Balance is an output. Health is the input. Health is the input. The test reads the output. Well, what can be done? Because the degradation is real, but the system's response to challenge is also real. Vestibular hair cells are lost permanently. Peripheral nerve conduction velocity does not spontaneously increase. Purkinje cells do not regenerate. But the brain's interpretation of the signals that remain is plastic, and the plasticity persists throughout life. Rehabilitation. Exercises that challenge the vestibular system with head movements during standing and walking improves balance test performance in older adults, not by restoring lost sensors, but by recalibrating the cerebellum's weighting of remaining inputs. The cerebellum compensates, increasing reliance on proprioception and vision when vestibular input is degraded, or increasing vestibular reliance when proprioception is impaired. This re-weighting is a form of neuroplasticity that the cerebellum retains into the 9th decade of life. Lee and colleagues published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that Tai Chi, which involves sustained single-leg stances and slow weight shifts through positions that challenge all 4 balance systems simultaneously, reduced fall incidence by approximately 55% in adults over 70, 55%. No pharmaceutical intervention for fall prevention approaches that effect size. The mechanism is not strength gain. The muscles involved in balance correction are not significantly hypertrophied by Tai Chi practice. The mechanism is sensorimotor recalibration. Repeated practice of challenging balance positions forces the cerebellum to update its predictive models using the sensory inputs still available, to extract more information from fewer sensors, to compensate for slower nerve conduction by adjusting the timing of corrections, to re-weight the contribution of each system based on which ones are still performing adequately. A person with significant vestibular hair cell loss who practices balance regularly develops stronger reliance on proprioceptive and visual input. The cerebellum learns to build its spatial model from the systems that are still sending clean data. A person with peripheral neuropathy who practices balance develops stronger reliance on vestibular input, compensating for the degraded foot sensation by leaning harder on the inner ear signals that remain intact. The cerebellum does not restore the lost sensors. It reconfigures the computation to work with what remains. The recalibration persists only as long as the training continues. Sherrington's Cochrane review of fall prevention exercise confirmed that the effect reverts when the practice stops, because the underlying sensory degradation is ongoing. The compensation requires continuous input. The degradation does not pause. 10-second test is not a death sentence, it is a measurement. The measurement changes with training. The vestibular hair cells that are gone will not return. But the cerebellum, 50 billion neurons of integration engine, responds to practice by rewiring how it uses the signals that remain. Standing on one leg is not just a test, it is the training. Every second of challenged balance forces the cerebellum to recalibrate, to reweight, to adapt. Physics of the degradation is irreversible. The physics of the compensation is not. 4 systems: vestibular, proprioceptive, visual, cerebellar. Built across 500 million years of evolution, running a continuous integration loop at 100 Hz, maintaining your position relative to gravity with sub-degree precision, below conscious awareness, every second you are upright. Each one degrades with age. The hair cells die and are not replaced. The peripheral nerves slow. The Purkinje cells thin. The pressure sensors in the sole of the foot become coarser. The corrections arrive later. The sway amplitude grows. 10-second test measures the sum of all of it. The integrated output of every system that keeps you alive and vertical, captured in the simplest possible question: can you stand on one foot? A blood test reads one molecule at a time. An imaging study examines one organ at a time. The 10-second test reads the functional state of 4 systems simultaneously: cardiovascular, neurological, musculoskeletal, and vestibular, through a single output that requires all of them to be working and communicating at speed. No clinical test measures systemic integration the way standing on one leg does. study did not find that balance predicts health. It found that balance is health, the observable, measurable, real-time output of every system that matters, expressed through the body's most fundamental physical relationship with the planet, your relationship with gravity. That is what the 10 seconds measure.